I would like to extend an especially warm welcome to our plenary speakers, Professor Dr. Dagmar Divjak from the University of Birmingham, Assistant Professor Dr. Agnieszka Bentkowska-Kopczyk from the University of Graz, Dr. Kristina Štrkalj-Despot from the Institute of Croatian Language and Linguistics in Zagreb, Professor Dr. Mateusz Milan-Stanojević from the University of Zagreb, and Professor Dr. Zrinka Jelaska from the University of Zagreb. As the President of CALS and the President of the Organizing Committee, I would also like to thank all those who made this conference possible, the members of the Organizing Committee. I would not have been able to pull this off without their help. Thank you all for your hard work, encouraging thoughts, and patience above all. And there is still more ahead of us since the conference is just beginning. Now let's move to what we are all here for, the science. Let me first check if everything is ready with the equipment, because we will record this presentation. Thank you. We can start now. All right. And we would like to announce our first plenary speaker. I invite Anita to announce Professor Dr. Dagmar Divjak. Thank you.
Well, our first invited speaker definitely needs no introduction, since she is probably one of the most prominent names, at least in cognitive linguistics, if not wider. But I want to draw attention to some of the highlights of her career. So in January of this year, Professor Divjak has started working at the University of Birmingham as a professorial research fellow. She works with the Out of Our Minds team, whose goal is to understand and make language learning a more natural and rewarding experience. Prior to this, she was the director of Russian and Polish and the director of the Center for Linguistics Research at the University of Sheffield, where she also led the establishment of the Hume Lab, an experimental facility for interdisciplinary research in arts and humanities. Her main research interests are in understanding the relation between our general and individual cognitive abilities and the patterns and structures we see in language. She has worked extensively on charting what language has to offer the learner in their quest for the meaning of words and constructions. Currently, she is contributing to putting usage-based theories on a cognitively sounder footing by exploring which distributional patterns learners discover in data, given existing constraints on memory and attention. Among other duties, she is Associate Editor of Cognitive Linguistics, co-edits de Groote's Cognitive Linguistic Research book series, and sits on the editorial boards of a number of journals, including Linguistics. She is the author of 2 monographs, one, if I'm not mistaken, under contract, has published 6 edited books, 22 chapters in books, and 90 papers in refereed journals. I apologize if my math is wrong, but it's not easy when we are dealing with such high numbers. So, would you do us the honor of presenting your work to us?
Thank you for the nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me to come and speak at the conference. It's really nice to have this opportunity to come and talk to you about the work we're doing with the Out of Our Minds team in Birmingham. I'll start with a bit of, is it this one? With a bit of background. As Anita said, in the Out of Our Minds project, we are trying to understand better what native speakers really know about their language to eventually make foreign language learning easier or a more enjoyable experience, especially learning hard or relatively hard languages. And as you know, I work within the usage-based linguistic framework. And what attracted me to the usage-based theories of language is that we don't rely on any innate language-specific modules to explain how knowledge of language comes about. Instead, we assume that our abilities to extract and entrench distribution of patterns will enable speakers or learners of a language to build the grammar from the ground up using their main general cognitive abilities. But as a cognitive linguist, I often feel torn between the 2 parts of the label that I associate with. On the one hand, there are linguistic techniques that can be used to provide economically and descriptions that provide good coverage of the phenomenon that you're looking at, but that may not be cognitively realistic at all. And on the other hand, I can go for more cognitive approaches that would ensure that my descriptions are cognitively realistic, but that may not seem to be doing so well in terms of describing what I'm actually looking at. And then my question is, what do I do? Do I compromise, or do I choose one or the other? And the conundrum for me really is determining whether the patterns we find in the data are real. If you mean by that question, do the patterns that you find in the data exist in the data? Oh, sorry. then the answer is obviously yes. You found it in the data. It is there. But does it mean that because you found something in the data using a statistical technique that finds structured data, does it mean that the structures also exist in the minds of speakers? And the answer there is only possibly. Not all regularities that exist in the data are necessarily discovered and exploited by speakers of a language. And it's probably the case that not all speakers of a language discover and exploit the same subsets of regularities. I'm particularly interested in whether linguists and non-linguists focus on the same types of patterns, and that's what this talk is going to be about. So in the first, I'm going to present a few case studies. The first one is a bit of a historical one. It goes back to work that I did for my PhD dissertation, and that really bothered me for more than a decade. So I kept on going back to it and trying to answer the question more adequately. It has to do with Givon's binding scale, which is basically a linguistic construct that allows us to measure how integrated two verbs are if they're used together in one sentence. Like I decided to give a talk at a conference, for example. And this whole discussion goes back to the history of linguistics in the 20th century. So we all know that initially and for much of the 20th century, structuralism was a dominant linguistic framework. And structuralists did a very nice thing for linguists. They divided language or knowledge of language up in langue and parole. So one was the structure, the other one was the usage. They said we don't need to bother with the usage, we're just focused on structure, which is the neat and tidy side of linguistics, and you can capture it in paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationships. There is no mess. So it made our task a lot easier. This was then picked up by the generativists, and it re-emerged as competence versus performance, and generativists are only interested in competence, not so much in performance. So again, things stayed neat and tidy. But a lot of phenomena could not really be captured adequately with such an approach. Functional and cognitive linguists have taken another, completely different perspective, and they have focused on usage, because after all, usage is what is observable. But in a lot of cognitive and functional work, including my own, you can easily ask, well, okay, this is all about usage, but where is now the structure? Structure seems to be ignored, at least to a large extent, in cognitive functional work. So the question that I wanted to answer in this case study is, how do usage and structure relate? We know that structure should be an abstraction over usage, but usage varies, and how much of variation is actually discarded in our search for structure? And another question I wanted to understand better is, how do individual and system relate? So how much of a system needs to be internalized by individual speakers to emerge to the eye of the linguist, so to speak? Oh, this is too fast. Okay, so the case study is going to be about a specific pattern, and I'm going to talk about the Polish data. It's the same in Russian, it's the same in English as well. So it's about a finite verb and an infinitive that are used together in one clause, really, like she decided to write a book. Normally you only need one verb to form a sentence. She took a decision, or she wrote a book, but in this case we have two. And the assumption is that if you have two verbs in one sentence, this iconically, so the language iconically signals that there is a high degree of event integration between the two events expressed by the verbs. If you say there is a high or a higher degree of event integration, ideally you would try somehow to measure that. And I did that by relying on 3 diagnostic tests that were inspired by the function of verbs. So with sentences like she decided to write a book, You can do a few different modifications or alternations. You can check whether the infinitive could be the direct object to the finite verb, which is sometimes possible, sometimes not. You can also check whether the infinitive can be expanded into a full subordinate clause, which again is sometimes possible, sometimes not. And you can also check whether the two events that are expressed can take place at different moments in time. Could I do one yesterday and the other tomorrow, or are they so tightly integrated that they both happened at the same time? And this is basically also what underlies Vivon's binding scale for English. So this is a scale of looser to tighter integration between two events. And my reasoning was that if we have verbs that occur in at least one of these three diagnostic constructions, then we're dealing with, to some extent, independent events, like she decided to write a book. I could take the decision last year and write a book next year. But if we see that we have verbs that don't pass any of these three diagnostic tests, we would be dealing with complex integrated events, like she had to write a book. I cannot do the having last year and the book writing the next year. So this is really a very simple way of operationalizing the measurement of integration. Now when you do this, for Polish, for example, Polish has 90 verbs that combine with an infinitive. When you put all of these 90 verbs through all of the three tests, you get this very, to the linguistic eye, very pleasing, neat and tidy classification with 8 different categories. And from the left to the right, we have an increase of dependence of the finite verb on the infinitive. But there it gets better. Actually, when you look inside each of these beautiful 8 categories, you see that these categories also are semantically coherent. So the 8th category, for example, the verbs that really rely on their infinitive, they express things like modality, intention, attempt, result, and phase. So again, to the linguist, extremely pleasing because you have syntax and semantics that nicely align. The question is this only in my head as a linguist, or do native speakers actually develop a similar system from usage? So that the question was answered with a survey of native speakers of Polish. Agnieszka here in the front row actually helped me collect the data a few years ago. There were 285 in total. They all were all university students, so highly educated, and they studied modern foreign languages, so you can say they were definitely sensitive to the intricacies of language. And I asked them, for all of these 90 verbs, randomly shuffled, all things like that, all controlled. For each of those 3 diagnostic tests, how does this sentence sound to you in Polish? And it was a 5-point Likert scale. So I asked them to use -2 if the sentence was really weird and might be difficult to understand. I used them to use 0 when they said like, yeah, okay, a native speaker could produce such a sentence, but it isn't perfect. And this seemed really important when working with Slavic languages that have a strong prescriptive tradition, because people would say, I would never say that, and then the next turn you catch them saying exactly that. So they could blame it on other people saying these things. And then I had the top score, the natural Polish, for sentences that are fully normal and understandable. Now, after asking so many questions of so many participants, I had an enormous amount of data that I couldn't eyeball anymore or put into neat and tidy categories. So instead I used cluster analysis, which is a statistical exploratory technique that basically finds structure in large amounts of data. My data was ordinal. There aren't really any cluster techniques that specifically developed for ordinal data. So I tried a few different things, also because they provided different answers to the question that I was asking. So first I tried by summing all of the scores. So all of the -2s and the 2s that people gave, what result would that give me? The thing with this is that you discard variation, because say you get a score of 10, that could equally well be the result of 2 people giving 2 5s and 3 people giving 0s, or of 5 people giving 2, so you don't really know what's going on. And therefore I also tried summating the proportions of responses, so counting how many people assigned a specific score, which retains more of the variation in the answers. And the results are very different. So the results of these summated responses are as confusing as you see in this plot. There are many, many clusters, so all of these little links are different kinds of groups. Not 8, not the 8 I was hoping for. So I tried to be smart and I said, okay, there are too many clusters. What solution would be optimal? And it turned out that a 7-cluster solution would be optimal. But I still wasn't lucky because if the cluster solution, if all the clusters are coherent, these would be like gray rectangles, and mine are a little bit more like steep mountains, which means that basically these verbs are already more similar to that category than they are to their own category. And as you can see from this value there, basically says like, okay, I found structure for you, really done my best, but I can't guarantee that it means anything. And it didn't mean anything. So continuing on this number of techniques that cluster analysis offers, you can calculate something that's called a medoid, which is a bit like a prototype. So it's that element in a cluster that is least dissimilar to all of the other elements at the same time. This is the category for a cluster that has budge, like to be afraid, as the prototype. But when you look at the other verbs that are in that category, you can see that there's really no semantic similarity to be afraid. There seems to be other semantic similarity going on, but not to the core element of the category. So I went to my other type of summarizing the data, so summarizing the proportions, the number of people who had given a particular answer. And in the first attempt, I kept the 5-point scoring system. So I calculated how many people found it very natural, slightly less natural, okay, slightly bad, and very unnatural. And when I did that, I had the same mess, basically. Lots and lots of clusters. So I tried a few replications to see which clusters would actually replicate, so can be thought to be reliable, and those are the ones that are highlighted. On the plot, you can see there are very few, I think 7 or 9, something like that. And they each contain between 2 and 6 verbs, and even the clusters that contain 2 verbs don't contain verbs that are semantically similar to each other. Don't laugh, it's not funny. So there were many low-level clusters, but there is no motivation for any of those clusters. And you would expect, okay, cognitive linguistics assumes that there are going to be more low-level generalizations over high-level generalizations, but there needs to be some kind of generalization. And there was no evidence for any generalization. There was no phonological resemblance, no morphological resemblance, and no semantic resemblance. And also, if you have a number of 100 verbs and you get a few little clusters of 2, that doesn't really tell you anything about the system. So my last attempt, third time is a charm. In this case, I summated proportions of answers, but I simplified the rating scale. So I had constructions that were bad, that were okay, and that were good. I did the same thing again, and suddenly 2 clusters pop up. So suddenly we have high-level generalizations. Here on the left, there's a category of 22 verbs, and on the right, we have all of the rest together, which I thought was very pretty, because it really nicely corresponded to another summary of my 8-point rating scale. So you have the 22 verbs from category A together, and then all of the rest distinct, well, together in one big category. And it got even better, because the category that was distinguished, the 22 verbs that were identified as similar in the cluster analysis, were actually also semantically similar to the verbs that I had identified on the basis of my manual analysis. So with very few exceptions, and the exceptions are those that don't have a label in the classification column, those were the exact same verbs. So again, modality, phase, result, attempt, and intention. So what seems to have happened is that native speakers recognize the syntactic limitations on those verbs that are most integrated with their infinitive, and that emerges as a category. But for the remainder, so the other 70 verbs, there doesn't seem to be a clear shared preference. So we cannot say that any of the distinctions that we as linguists see in the data are meant to be real for a sufficient number of native speakers. But even a supported two-way classification only emerged when I summarized the data as proportion of respondents who assigned a score on a simplified rating scale. So it's basically a social construct that discards a lot of the variation in the input. Which led to a different type of approach. So basically asking which patterns that we see in the data also exist in the minds of native speakers of a language, and seeing whether we can use that information to improve not only how we describe languages, but also how we teach languages, is the topic of the Out of Our Minds project that we run at the University of Birmingham with my collaborator Peter Millen, who's also, yes, waving from the back. So I'm going to present 3 case studies briefly that we have. We're in the 2nd year of our project, so I'm going to present the 3 studies that we've conducted during the 1st year, and that all speak to this same problem, but in a different way. So the first study I'm going to present is currently under revision. It deals with the concept of construal in cognitive linguistics. So, as you all know, language offers a number of ways in which one and the same situation can be described. So speakers typically have to make a choice, and that's why cognitive linguists say that meaning is made or constructed. It's not given by the situation, it is partly given by the way in which speakers decide to describe the situation. And the choice of describing a scene, so which linguistic construction you choose to put as label on a scene, in a cognitive linguistic approach reflects how a speaker conceptualizes that scene. And in a nutshell, this is basically the cognitive linguistic interpretation of what attention does with language. So basically, your way of phrasing something redistributes the attention over the elements in the scene. So when you look at this policeman who's arresting a guy, if you say the police arrested a man, you use the active construction, you're focusing on the agent. If you say a man was arrested by the police, using a passive construction, you focus on the patient. This is a big foundational concept in cognitive linguistics, and it's been used successfully to describe a range of phenomena, but it's a bit the same as the binding scale that I started with. It's something that linguists see in the data. The question is, of course, do native speakers of a language have the same intuitions when they are exposed to the same kinds of constructions? And that was the point of the case study. So, does construal capture differences in mental reality associated with constructions in the larger population, not just in the population of highly trained linguists? Now, construal is a little bit difficult to operationalize because it's a very fuzzy concept, but we decided to go via ception, which is a concept proposed by Talmy, and very elegantly and conveniently unites perception and conception. By adding this perception dimension to the question, it suddenly became possible for us to operationalize construal, because we could embed this question within the larger framework of studies on visual perception and language-guided visual perception in particular, which has used a lot of eye tracking, and also which we could embed our question within studies on attention. Generally, the question that's asked there is under which circumstances does attention for a specific aspect of a situation affect grammatical encoding? What we wanted to ask is what kind of differences in grammatical encoding affect visual attention for a specific aspect of a situation. So if can we, by phrasing something differently, change the way in which people look at the scene and then later on also conceptualize the scene. So our design was an eye-tracking design with 60 participants. First, we showed them an image only, like the policeman and the villain. This was just for us to record their default viewing pattern. So if they see a scene like that, how do they look at that scene? And we also hope that this would eliminate any salient image properties. You can expect that if you have a black and white picture and suddenly you have like a red flower in it, that people will look at that. But there are things that you cannot predict. And we wanted to eliminate those by having their default viewing first. And then we exposed them to the same images, but first we played a sentence that described the scene, and then we let them look at the picture again. So first there was sound, then there was image, so these things were consecutive in research on scene perception. Typically, things are done at the same time, so they look at an image while they listen to a sentence. We're not so interested in language processing as it unfolds. We're interested in what happens after language has been processed initially, what goes into memory, how does it affect conceptualization. Now, I'm not going to say much about eye tracking, just that the one thing you need to do when you run an eye tracking study is define your areas of interest. Because typically in this paradigm, the images that are used are very artificial. You have, like, for example, if you have a man, a guy, a policeman, and an arrestation, you would have the man in the left side, the left top corner, the policeman in the other top corner. Then you will have like handcuffs in the right lower corner and something distracting in the left lower corner, which is not the natural way of seeing anything at all. So we really wanted to have realistic images, but that also makes it harder to define where people are supposed to look and what counts as a look in the right direction and what doesn't. So what we did is we summarized data from our first participants. We created this kind of heat maps. Actually, the software does it for us. And then we drew our interest areas by hand. So if you can see, when people look at this picture, for example, they will look at the face of one man, the face of the other man, and then at the hands, which would be the symbol of arrest. So the face of the policeman would be our agent, the face of the other guy would be our patient, and then that blob in the middle over the hands, that would be our event. So that's where we measured all the looks in those areas counted. And you know from the first case study that I really like clines, so we have a cline here too. So we looked at 3 types of constructions. One was a preposition. Things like the shelves are over the desk is under the shelves. This is Lanneker's example of construal and language. Then you have construction that has been studied extensively in linguistics, both generative and cognitive. That's the voice alternation, so the nurse vaccinated the patient versus the patient was vaccinated by the nurse. And then there's a dative construction, which is the most famous construction in linguistic analysis. The boy gave the girl a flower, or the boy gave the flower to the girl. And as you can see, in all of these sentences, the 2 or the 3 areas of interest change place. So first you mention shelves, or first you mention desk, first you mention nurse, or first you mention patient. And then at the end you have a swap between girl and flower. The preposition is the clearest place changing. It's also the clearest visual distinction, whereas the dative is the most subtle one. So we also expected a line of effects with the strongest effects for the preposition and the smallest effects of construal on perception and hence conception in the dative. And we used 3 measures from the 150, if not more, that the eye tracking software provides. One was the order of access. So we wanted to know, that was the main measure, in which order do participants scan the interest areas? Do they look at the agent first? Do they look at the patient first? We also collected information on first gaze duration. So how long do they look at an interest area when they first enter that area? And the overall gaze duration captures how long they looked at an interest area in total. So in total they had 3.5 seconds to view the scene. How many of those seconds in total were spent on the agent or the patient, depending on the construal. And the results nicely confirmed our climb. So for the prepositions, we had effects across 2 measures. So if you say the shelves are above the table or the table is underneath the shelves, then people will indeed look at the shelves first, or they will look at the table first. It also, the change in construal also changes how long you initially look at the interest area. For voice, we had an effect in order of access, so they will look at agent first in an active construction, or patient first in a passive construction, but not on any of the other measures. And for the dative, we had no effects at all. And this is a bit ironic, because linguists have spent most of their efforts finding the intricate differences between the 2 dative constructions. But native speakers don't seem to be that bothered. I mean, we know from experiments that they are sensitive to these things, but maybe it's just a stylistic device. Maybe it doesn't seem to be anything that changes the way in which you perceive the situation. Which dative construction is used doesn't change anything at all. Which preposition is used, or which voice construction is used is a different matter. So in the second case study that I would like to present to you, we go a bit further along this path of, are we as linguists really looking at the right thing? Are we not making too much of things that don't matter to native speakers? And in this case, I particularly want to highlight, are we maybe missing things that are really important to native speakers? And this is a case study on the genitive singular for inanimate nouns in Polish, which has a choice between a and u. But as is adequately described in grammars of Polish, the occurrence of a or u is basically the result of a historical mess, and it's governed by factors which are impossible to unravel completely. And for some nouns, usage is not definitively established. Now, you had a very diligent Pole, Westphal, who devoted most of his life to figuring out the rules for a or u selection in masculine inanimate nouns, and he came up with 360-page monograph that has very nice subdivisions. I don't know whether you can see any of them, but for example, the first class in the first group deals with chess pieces. So, yes, and he goes on to nuts and exotic meals and baked goods, especially cereal-produced baked goods. It is so specific as to be of virtually no usage at all. You might as well memorize things item by item than to try and deal with his rules. Now, there has been a lot of research on this. There are phonetic, morphological, and semantic criteria, but they give at best contradictory results. So, for example, your phonetics would say, oh, you need a, but then your morphology says, no, you need u, and again, you're stuck with the same problem. My favorite example deals with front parts and back parts, rear parts of the body. So someone came up with the generalization for body parts, that front parts of the body would take a, and rear parts of the body would take u. But there is just a very unfortunate exception, and that's that the word for the prototypical front part of the body, bust, does the opposite, and the prototypical rear part of the body, bum, also does the opposite. So not even the prototypes follow the rules. But as we are good corpus linguists, we did honor the linguistic tradition, and we ran a very extensive corpus-based study. So we annotated 5,000 of these nouns for the linguistic variables that had been proposed. So you have typical phonology, you have typical morphology, and you also have semantic properties, size and type of the object in particular. Oh, you can't really see that very well, right? So the two you cannot see at the end, the red ones, they are the most important ones. So apparently, if you have a count noun, you can reliably say that your noun is going to take an a. If you have a mass noun, a collective noun, or a substance, you should pretty reliably be able to say u. Except that this didn't come out of the corpus study at all. So when we did the regression analysis, it turned out that all of these variables were significant, so we're definitely onto something with our linguistic analysis, except mass and collective, which allegedly are the ones that work best. And Eva Dombrovska did some experiments where she was interested in the count versus substance, and her results showed that there was an effect of count versus substance, but when she looked in more detail, she saw that only 2 of her participants actually made that distinction, but they made it very, very, very systematically. The rest of her participants was basically performing at the random level. So there is no evidence for count versus substance in the larger population experimentally either. So what we did instead then is use learning algorithm that Peter developed. I'm not going to say much about it. If you want to speak to the algorithm, he speaks, he's in the back there. I'm just going to say that it learns from data in a way that is biologically realistic. So it comes from literature on animal learning. It has a lot of experimental evidence behind it, and there is quite a bit of linguistic research as well that has used this. And we're going to see whether this algorithm can figure out when to use a and when to use u. And we wanted to challenge it a bit more. I just mentioned Westphal, the guy who wrote a 360-page book on chess pieces and exotic fruits and things like that. So he concluded, and in the end, I think he was really frustrated, and he said, like, well, the u is really much more elegant and a is rough. It would be nice if our algorithm would agree. The way in which I like to think of the algorithm myself is with Yoda's words. So linguists have always used frequency to use as positive evidence, but learning theory also shows that we learn from our errors as well. So what you need to remember is only this: the greatest teacher failure is. the equation is here. Oh, part is missing. Anyway, so there is positive evidence, but there is also error-driven recalibration. So you don't just go on what you hear, you also go on the things that you have done wrong. Of course, we don't want to feed that algorithm very sophisticated linguistic information because we assume that native speakers don't have access to that either. So basically what we fed it were sounds and words. So in NDL terminology, this would be our graphome to lexome network, where we basically try to figure out, and we use 3-letter sequences, which of these 3-letter sequences is associated with one of those words. And as you accumulate experience with those sounds, you will see that, okay, you start expecting tsuda when you hear tsud, and you start expecting puga, pugu when you hear the beginning of that word. You will not expect tsuda from any of those, or the other way around. From this network, a number of measures can be derived, and the one that's going to be important for us today is diversity. So how many words do these 3-letter combinations in the input activate? We also gave it a bit of meaning, basically raw co-occurrence information. So which words occur together with which other words in the input. And you can see those at the top. The principle is the same, so you will have words that occur with miracles, and you will have words that occur with plow, and then you see that you like to investigate miracles and that you like to talk about the position of the plow, but you won't talk about the position of a miracle and you will not investigate the plow. Basically, the principle is the same, so you develop an association between certain words and not between other words. And here again, you can derive a number of measures from that. And what's important here is going to be the prior, which is a bit like frequency, so how well does the semantic system know the word? And when we analyze the data, we get a very nice and simple result. So when we look at the sound input, so the trigraphs, we found that if the last 2 letters in a word, knowing that it is the word and, if they activate few words, then we get a. And this can be interpreted as these sounds really are atypical for Polish. If the sounds are typical for Polish and they activate many words, we get u. When we look at the co-occurrence information, then we see that you get a for words that are not well entrenched, so that are not well represented in experience, and you get u for words that are well entrenched, so well represented in experience. Summarized as a is for atypical sound sequences and poorly entrenched words, and u is for typical sound sequences and well-entrenched words. And this is much simpler, and you can imagine that native speakers of Polish could actually use this as like a rough classification device, like, this sounds really weird to me. I don't know the word very well either. Let's stick it on to the end and the other way around. But this also confirms the hypothesis of for Westphal that you have the rough a for things that don't sound really very Polish, and then you have the elegant o for the very Polish sounds. Now to make sure that what we found is not just something the algorithm liked and something we liked because it was simple, we did a nonce word task with native speakers of Polish. So we created 500 nonce words, and we put them in a context that requires a genitive, a very simple context, just nie ma, there is no, in which case you have to use a genitive in Polish. And then we made native speakers of Polish choose between the a version of the nonce word and the u version of the nonce word. And what we got nicely confirms our finding that if there is higher diversity, if these are sounds that occur in many, many words, you are more likely to get u. If these are sounds that occur in fewer words, you are more likely to get a. And then to be absolutely sure that we weren't getting any patterns just because we were aggregating so much data, because you always run the risk that if you get data from a lot of people, that some are doing this like Eva had in her experiment, some are doing this but others are not doing that at all, and you just get an average result that doesn't apply to anyone. We also plotted the variation in our participants, and as you can see, here you have a few people who really biased to u and use u in 75% of all cases, Here you have people who are biased towards A, but the majority of the participants didn't have a bias and really must have taken the properties of the phonetic properties of the word into account to make that decision. And then the last case study that I will present very briefly has to do with navigating patterns more generally. So in cognitive linguistics, we're very big on patterns, and our ability to detect these patterns and entrench those patterns would form the basis on which we build up our knowledge of grammar. But the question is, do we ever turn that ability off? Does it only pop into action when we deal with past tenses or case endings? Or are we such determined pattern seekers that we will look for patterns anywhere and everywhere? So there is evidence for an association between our implicit pattern learning abilities and language processing and representation, but we were interested in whether this would go any further. Does this need to find patterns also play a role more generally in any situation in which we are exposed with language? And for that, we did this experiment on Russian. So we had 39 adult native speakers of Russian. They were all, again, university students, highly educated. But this time, they were not linguists or language students. They came from a range of different disciplines. And we asked them to do 2 tasks. The first task we asked them to do was this serial reaction time task, which is a standard measure of implicit learning ability. And it basically measures how much better you get at recognizing sequences that are structured and statistically consistent. So what we do is we show them stars that appear on the screen, and they press the corresponding button on a button box, and the reaction time of those button boxes is recorded. So first we showed them stars in which there was no pattern, then we showed them stars in which there was a pattern, and then we tested them at the end. They didn't know in which phase of the experiment they were. But the expectation generally is that you get faster as you discover and learn the pattern, because you can predict where the star is going to come next. And we also gave them a self-paced reading task, which was our measure of language processing ability. And it measures how people read patterns. Again, here you would expect that if the pattern is typical for a word, a noun, or a verb, so if it occurs in a form that it often occurs in, it would be easier for you to read that. It's important to bear in mind that in this task, you don't teach your participants anything. They just read sentences that are taken from a corpus, that words that they have encountered before. But that seems to have been a wrong assumption. So to give you an idea, that's how it goes, but you press the button yourself when you're ready to go to the next word. Each time you press the button, your reaction time is recorded, and we expect that you read words faster that are typical, that occur very often. I will skip the linguistic analysis of this bit, which was also interesting, but what I would like to focus on here is the second hypothesis, so that has to do with whether we ever turn off this pattern learning ability or not. And the hypothesis was that people who are better at learning patterns will explore more and will collect more information and more relevant information to explore later. So it's not just whether people are good at pattern learning in language, but also where they find their patterns and where they go and look for them. That will also affect what they can actually pick up. Of course, we had to implement exploration. So how do you measure the extent to which people explored the sentences or the context in which they are exposed? And for this, we relied on work by a colleague from Sheffield who had looked at performance improvements in game players. And he had found that people who play online video games and explore more at the beginning, actually, so make more errors, try more different things, actually end up being the better players than those who are really relatively good from the start. And what they used for this was a standard deviation on their reaction times, which is basically how much group members differ from the group mean. So the standard deviation was the index of exploration, and we also used that in our research. So we calculated a rolling standard deviation on the reaction time. So we calculated an average, so to speak, for 3 consecutive words, and then saw how much each individual deviated from what was normal for the group. We analyzed this data with a quantile regression. If any of you is interested in finding out how this works, but there's having a workshop on Saturday. You can talk to him if you want to join. And I'll summarize the results really briefly. So there was an interaction between the standard deviations on the reading times and at the sentence level, but also at the level of the experiment. So within the sentence, you have words that belong together and they form a coherent whole. But across the experiment, things don't really form a coherent whole because all of these sentences are meaningful in and of themselves, but the sentences that follow each other in the experiment don't form a story. So you have to read a sentence, disconnect, read a sentence, mentally disconnect. So we found a different relationship for the type of learner that you are. So it turns out that if you are a good pattern learner, then you actually show most evidence of exploration at the sentence level. So the way in which you work your way through these words that form a sentence is different for people who are good pattern learners than for people who are poor pattern learners. For the poor pattern learners, we found exploration at the level of the experiment. So they try and find patterns where there really aren't any, because the sentences are randomly chosen and don't form a story when you put them together. So individuals differ in their readiness to explore the environment in order to adapt, but then you have the good pattern learners, which we call the content-sensitive learners. They're more likely to explore and exploit at the more relevant level. So they focus on the sentence level and didn't really engage with how the sentences fit together across the experiment. They figured out, this is nonsensical, I can't find any patterns here. Whereas the poor pattern learners, which is not a politically correct term, so we call them task-sensitive learners, they explored less at the level of the sentence, and they explored mainly at the sentence of the experiment, but that is not a relevant level to explore. There is no pattern to be found. So basically what they do is they're worse at spotting patterns, so that also means that the information that they have available for later use is less relevant. So in cognitive linguistics, it's often been said, okay, there are individual differences in what people know about and how well they know their language, and it's always been put down to, this is a difference in input, they read more, they read less, they live in a less varied linguistically varied environment. But even if you keep your environment the same and give them the exact same sentences, people will approach these sentences very differently. So the real conclusion then is, are the patterns we find in the data real? No, not all regularities are discovered and exploited, and those that are discovered do not all have mental status for individuals. Think back of the bindings here, think back of construal and the dative. Not everyone discovers and exploits the same regularities, and certainly linguists and speakers are not always on the same line. We focus all of our efforts on describing the dative, but native speakers don't really care which dative you choose when you describe a scene. And this has some resemblance, or the conclusions we would like to draw from this has some resemblance to dual processing theories in psychology, which are very popular and also very heavily criticized, so I don't want to go into detail about them. The very basics are that there is something like fast thinking and slow thinking, and the fast thinking would have to do with subconscious processes, with intuition, with instinct, and the slow thinking is conscious thought, and conscious reason, and conscious planning. And it seems to be that we as linguists have put all of our efforts into the conscious box, the slow box. So all of our explanations are very rich, they're meaningful, and they work, but only when you already know the system. So when you already know which genitive ending to use, you can say, yes, this is because it's a chess piece. This is because it's a serially produced sweet or something like that. But it doesn't help learners of the language figure out how the language actually works. So what we want to do with the project is pay more attention to these fast processes that have been ignored to a large extent in linguistics. A quick pitch, we have a PhD position available, so if any of your students knows Polish and would be interested in writing a PhD in linguistics, do send them our way. And thank you for your attention.